I get the question a lot when I talk to different people. Well, what are we supposed to be up to in the universe? And I think one fun way of responding to that is saying, well, what you should be up to in the universe is what the universe is up to in you.
Hi, welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley, and joining me today is Dr. Andrew M. Davis. Andrew is a philosopher and theologian, and he's the program director at the Center for Process Studies. And we might not have mentioned the center explicitly on the show before, but we've definitely talked about the inspiration for that title, and that is the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. So we're going to be getting into a little bit of that with Andrew, as well as some recent work of his. Of course, he is the author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books, but the latest of those are Metaphysics of Exo-Life Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmotheology. And he's the editor of a book, a collection of essays that I believe contained the initial seed of that book. And this one, the collection, is called Astrophilosophy, Exo-Theology, and Cosmic Religion: Extraterrestrial Life in a Process Universe. So that sounds very intriguing. We're going to get into it. So welcome to the show, Andrew. Nice to have you.
It's great to join you. Thanks, Harrison.
So I guess to start out with, maybe you can give us a little bit of background on both your history, so how you got into like Whitehead and this field in particular, but then also how you how long has it been since you've been applying this philosophy to this specific area, which, there were some words just in those titles that I think a lot of viewers and listeners won't be familiar with. So maybe just get into a little bit of that background and we'll go from there.
Yeah, you betcha. Well, I've got no shortage of either praise or critique for the titles of these books, which are capturing of attention. So yeah, my background is first and foremost a sort of theological background. And, I was raised in a Protestant sort of evangelical world where the limitations on my thinking with respect to the universe were sort of just there. I took them for granted. But there was certainly a deep philosophical side to myself that was beginning to get nurtured. So in these early classes on science or biblical studies, I enjoyed them because there was a space for openness, a space for critique, where the mind could wander, where questions were unsettled. So I remember even as a young kid looking out to the stars with my friends and just being enchanted and inspired by it, and wondering naturally as to whether we are the only life and mind in the universe. Whether we are the only solar system. Of course, we knew then that we weren't, but in my young mind, I just was encapsulated in something much larger than myself and was naturally led to ask some of these questions. So I think if you fast forward, my theological development goes through various twists and turns. I develop an interest onto the philosophical side of things, the philosophy undergirding much of theological conviction. This has been a sort of intimate tango between philosophy and theology throughout history. And of course, science is a wonderful part of that as well. I think Whitehead, at least, for helping me see the ways in which metaphysics, science, and theology all are entangled with one another and all in a deep sense presuppose one another in certain conceptions. If I race forward a bit, 2017 is the year when I am working in the midst of my doctoral program at Claremont School of Theology. By that time, I had discovered Whitehead, been really just surprised and intrigued by his understanding. I'd been reading some of Whitehead's thinking for a while. And I was a teaching assistant in 2017 for Roland Faber, who at the time was the chair of process studies at Claremont School of Theology. And so in my role there as a teaching assistant, research assistant, we put together a course, which was the first of its kind at Claremont, and I'd say in most universities. And the title of that course was Religion and Extraterrestrial Life. And the focus of that course, in brief, was to look at some of the history surrounding the debates surrounding religion, science, and extraterrestrial life. So we had a deep historical component to it. We had a philosophical component to it. And of course, we had a sort of contemporary theological component to it, which tried to wrestle through these debates, including what the impact of discovery would be for philosophical systems and especially religious and theological worldviews. So it is more of a recent interest of mine, but the seeds were sown there in 2017. And that's where I first was sort of introduced to this larger discussion that has been going on for millennia. So that might be a snapshot of some background.
Well, this might be tangential, but we'll see. But there's a little bit of I see a little bit of a coincidence in there in 2017, because of course, since 2017, that is when kind of UFOs re-entered the kind of popular discourse, or actually the mainstream discourse, with the famous New York Times article. And so since then, there's been what you might call like a renewed or invigorated academic interest and academic openness to a whole range of topics, whether it's like UFOs as UFOs, or just the broader ideas of extraterrestrial life. Like you've got Avi Loeb doing his stuff, and then just recently, I'm pretty sure he was one of the speakers at the recent, or just end of last year, the Soul Foundation conference, where they were discussing all these kinds of things. And there's even a couple philosophers. Actually, in this area, kind of, you've got, like, in religious studies, you've got Diana Walsh Pasulka, who's been writing books on UFOs and UFO experiences, experiences with so-called non-human intelligences. And then you've got a colleague of hers, James Madden, who's a philosopher, who's written a book recently that I haven't read yet, called Unidentified Flying Hyperobject. And one of the ones I'll be wanting to get into, or that I'll be wanting to look at eventually. I haven't read it yet, but
absolutely.
But that, like I said, that may or may not be tangential to what you're talking about, because because I don't know if you're getting into the UFO lore or anything like that, or if you're sticking to more of just a framework for thinking about like the possibility of extraterrestrial life. So how exactly are you thinking about this?
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. First off, I'm familiar with these figures and these texts, which I do hope to get into, especially this hyperobjects text, which is sitting on my desk at present. So I do have want to make some time for that. But I think you bring up a really interesting point, just historically. And of course, UFO lore and phenomena and debate has been going on for a long time. But you're right. In 2017, we did see a certain re-energization of that, and increasingly so since that time. Right. So here we are in 2024, and the conversation is quite rich. The publications are rich at a level that is not easily dismissible, right? So that's that academic component I think you're pointing to, that there's a much broader range of public who are now wanting to take this phenomena much more seriously. It's not as if it hasn't been taken seriously in the past. I think of John Mack, at Harvard Medical School, and the various abduction phenomena he studied. And he kind of, these people weren't crazy, but he believed them in a certain sense, and he sort of gave it a spiritual spin. So it's super interesting. But to your question, you're right. That is more of a on the peripheral or tangential type of topic that I do hope to explore and need to explore in much more depth and detail because of its rising prevalence. So when I think of this 2017 class we put together and the ways I've been thinking about it since then, it has been more about thinking about a general philosophical framework. What are the presuppositions of this possibility that there is what Stephen Dick calls a biological universe, where life is not just isolated on one single planet, but utterly pervasive. So what does it do to physics and biology? How do we think about the fact that the possibility of life is in the nature of things before life itself is, right? This is a very interesting kind of metaphysical inquiry. So I've been interested in my recent work to make up for a certain neglect in the literature concerning the philosophical justifications or implications of this thinking. And that neglect has really been of Whitehead's thinking, both at a theological and philosophical level. So that's what I've hoped to do in the last two books. And I'm happy to say the conversation is booming and people are interested in it. And I hope it sticks around for quite a long time. That process thinking can make some inroads into this because there's been, at least over the last 20 years, a variety of different philosophical and theological texts that are wanting to respond to this topic. And there's history involved, and there's theory involved, there's science involved, and then there's experience involved, right? There are these anomalous experiences that people are having. But I haven't jumped into that experiential question just yet. But assuming that reality is there, we will need to think philosophically about a context which allows that to happen, a worldview that makes that plausible. So does that help? So it's on the peripheral, but I'm sketching the philosophical framework, at least doing so in an imaginative way.
Yeah, no, for sure that helps. One of the, okay, how am I going to get into this question? So one of, let's see, so coming from, like, for me, I'm familiar with kind of, passingly familiar with Whiteheadian thought and some of the, Whitehead himself and some of his, some of the secondary sources utilizing and expanding on his philosophy, like David Ray Griffin, of course, and sure. And it's John Buchanan who put us in touch. We've interviewed him a couple times on the show. Yeah, and I'm also passingly familiar with, like, all of the UFO literature and all that kind of stuff. So when I look at either, I kind of see. There hasn't been much overlap between the two. Now, of course, when we spoke with John on the program, he recommended to me the book by Olaf Stapledon, the Star Maker. Yes. Right. Of course, that's some sci-fi that's very relevant and that utilized Whitehead. But one of the kind of, I mentioned David Ray Griffin. One of the things that I liked so much about him is that he would go, let's say, like, outside the text from Whitehead. Like, he didn't look at Whitehead and just, like, not deviate at all from the concepts that Whitehead would write about. So, I mean, I think Whitehead only mentioned a couple times, for instance, like parapsychological matters, but he mentioned them and he was open to them. And then Griffin writes what I think is an amazing book. The one, I can't remember the exact title, but the one on parapsychology. I'll tell you,
right? Parapsychology, philosophy, and spirituality, a postmodern exploration.
Great. Yeah, I saw it in your bibliography for your book. Yeah, I've got it upstairs somewhere. But in that book, so he takes this, like, deep dive into an issue that a lot of mainstream academics at the time and still see as fringe, and he took it seriously and did one of the best overviews of that entire field, I think, and at the same time asked some questions that, again, were maybe, like, implicit in Whitehead's work, but maybe not explicitly laid out. For instance, the possibility of survival after death, and what would the nature of a being who of a self whose body has died, like, what is the nature of that form of existence? And so right there, that's almost like, I say that almost as a springboard into the type of theorizing that we can do and think about when it comes to extraterrestrial life, because not only is there a way of thinking of, like you said, the prevalence of life in the universe and biology in the universe, and that it may not be such a rare thing, but also that it opens up the idea of the nature of the different natures of beings, because of course Whitehead had this kind of stratified layer of thinking of these compound beings, where he's starting at very simple organisms to humans, and then there's, like, humans, and then jump up and there's conceptions of God, right? Well, what about all that space in between? Is there room for something in there? So
very good. Yeah.
So do either of those? So expand on either of those. Either the prevalence of biology, of life in the universe, and how to think about that, and this idea of forms of life, and have you thought about that in addition to the prevalence of biology?
Great. Yeah, let me just comment on Griffin quickly, because Griffin, obviously, in the Claremont tradition where I emerged from, it has been such a formative influence on the variety of topics, science, religion. I'm putting together a course for the fall right now where I'm going to be drawing from him and science, religion, and process perspective. But you're right that he wasn't a slave to just simply Whitehead's text, and no process thinker can be that, right? So sometimes people critique certain followers of Whitehead for being, far too slavish. And there's even a sort of playful statement where Whitehead's on his deathbed, sort of apocryphal, and tells those surrounding him, "I don't want any disciples." To which they reply, "Yes, master." So anyway, but absolutely, so Whitehead gives various hints of a lot of this kind of phenomena that we need to then creatively build off of and use his styles of thinking, his theories to do that. So Griffin did that beautifully, and you're right. I love that early text on parapsychology. Whitehead makes several statements that are quite interesting that don't indicate immediately a position, but what they do indicate, like on life after death, for example, is that we should follow the evidence provided that it's trustworthy, right? He has this important quota to that statement, right? So, and that's in Religion of the Making. My philosophy is agnostic as to whether there's life after death or there's spiritual beings beside God, but we should be open to the evidence provided that they're trustworthy. And Griffin, and even his late work on James and Whitehead on life after death, which is his second to last book, written presumably with his own mortality in view because he died only recently. And he lays out some of the history of Whitehead's interactions with those who were involved with research in parapsychology and psychical kinds of telepathy, clairvoyance, etc. So I think if we jump now to this discussion, it's good to see that Whitehead does offer certain indications, certain hints and possibilities that we can expand and develop fruitfully. So I don't know if you're familiar with Lucian Price's book, Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead. So Lucian Price was a friend of Whitehead, an early reporter, spent many hours with Whitehead and his wife at Harvard, talking all manner of topics. But interestingly enough, in that book, he makes several different statements about the possibilities of life being infinite in the universe, the scales and spectrum of life running from universes as small as those in an atom to those as large as the nebula being sentient entities, right? This is a statement he makes. And he, even in his text like Adventures of Ideas, he makes certain statements about, morality, there being no rigid codification of morality in the universe such that we should be careful not to just transplant our ideas of the good from our planet to life on another planet. So he has certain indications there. But even that sort of opens a space, but provided we don't have that, even he gives us a way of thinking about physics and biology that we have to extend outward. So I think just one of the most important statements, I think, and insights that I learned early on from Whitehead is this notion that human beings are far from being an exception to everything that's going on. We are an exemplification of what this universe is up to and what this universe is doing. And the starting point for philosophical reflection has to be this fact that we are part of nature, that our experience is a natural part, as natural as tree, waters, wind, and rain, and that we have to take that experience seriously and read it back down over nature and potentially up, all the way up in nature to levels of higher intelligence or higher being, and even a kind of divine level. So we see a merging of physics and biology in his doctrine of organism, right? So this notion of a reductive, materialistic universe that is at base level dead, which is a problem for a universe that is populated with life. Is that correct? And so he emerges with a certain critique of this and points to the ways in which different sciences are developing into a more organic picture of reality. And I think extending that beyond our planet is only natural. He did it at certain times. But this is sort of the context in which I'm wanting to imaginatively extend his ideas.
So how might this look? Now, again, Griffin, I've read most of his books, so I usually refer to him, as when I'm thinking about this kind of stuff. But in another his books, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's a shame to see Griffin pass, of course. If he would have stayed around a little longer, I'd be interested to see what he would say about this UFO phenomenon. Yeah. It's in the spirit of Griffin, his rigorous pursuit of truth, to comment on it and do so rigorously. Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Yeah, that's a shame. But so this was in another of his books. Now, this one, I can't remember which one it was in. But there's he writes about this in various of his books. But in this one, there was an extended discussion on the different conceptions of evolution. This might have been in the book. First title is God. I think it's or Religion and Scientific Naturalism. That might be the one. And there might be one other one that I'm thinking of where there's some some of the same types of issues, but
Mhm.
he's writing about different conceptions of evolution. And of course, you've got if you could imagine a spectrum, you've got kind of like the biblical creationists on the one hand, or on the one side, shading into kind of the more intelligent design that might be agnostic as to like, the biblical interpretations, into the kind of strict neo-Darwinism with like total materialism on the other hand, on the other side. And he was kind of trying to look at all of these accounts and placing them in a philosophical framework, and what makes sense, and how can we think about evolution, basically in a Whiteheadian manner. And just the picture in my head, I'm not sure if I even remember it correctly, but the picture in my head was basically, there's this back and forth between the organism itself and like this kind of almost like a Sheldrake kind of morphic field, or like an archetype. But when like as a being kind of self-evolves and becomes complex, like to explain that jump to another level, it's almost like unconsciously there's this attraction to that, to a new template, a creative template that is kind of grasped with like from a deep level of being, that then kind of like locks in and jumps the organism up to this new level of complexity. It's a way of basically
Nice.
The way I saw it was kind of a way of explaining the emergence of complexity without going either to the end of, oh, well, it's just one super being that's just tinkering with everything and creating everything, and there's no like freedom and self creativity on the bottom, to, well, creative or novelty and complexity just emerges from whatever's there and whatever's not complex, which of course doesn't make much sense either. So one of the things that made me think of in terms of kind of exobiology is, oftentimes, whether it's in science fiction or in people talking about UFOs and aliens, is that, oh, well, if there were to be an alien species, it would have to look nothing like us, because the chances are that just the way things work, we're just this random collection, totally dependent on the chance things that happened on our planet. Makes me think, well, maybe what if there is kind of like a template? Like, what would happen if we were to discover all of a sudden we go to all these different solar systems and they all have like a humanoid form? It's like, would we be like, well, no, that's impossible. That's not the way it works, because of the way evolution works. Or would we have to think, well, maybe we have to start rethinking about like where forms come from, why certain forms develop.
Sure.
Like, do you go that far?
Well, I do think it's such a fascinating question as to whether they'd have any kind of similar morphology. I guess my initial recoil from that is, even if we restrict our thoughts to our lovely pale blue dot, which we are standing, we see such an amazing diversity of formal life, of intelligent life. An octopi is an intelligent being of a pretty radical kind, but utterly fascinating in its complexity and morphology. It looks nothing like us. It's for all practical purposes an alien on this planet. So yeah, I mean, it is extremely interesting as to whether there is a template that eventually obtains in the evolution of different forms of life. And it may be that the template is not a formal template, as if we're going to share sort of certain bodily structures, but it may be a deeper ontological template. Like, for example, life itself. We still don't know quite what life is, but it would seem that whatever's in your ontology will find a higher expression as it evolves into deeper and more complex forms. So even Whitehead makes interesting statements that that the rudimentary forms of life belong to all kinds of physical experience. And that's quite interesting because, again, his is a rejection of the universe as comprised of vacuous, dead matter that's dead. And I think of even Hans Jonas in his wonderful book, The Phenomenon of Life, where he makes this interesting parallel saying, in ancient times, it was just taken for granted that everything was alive. Therefore, death was the problem. it's like, well, why do we die? Since it seems obvious that most things are alive, that life is this primal principle, and yet in this modern sort of turn, we sort of invert that. It's well, death is what the fundamental is, that what the fundamental universe is at a sort of base substrate level, and yet how do we get life? Now we have to make life the problem and invert that. So I think that's interesting, just in terms of how our perspectives are shifting. But I'm not sure. It's so easy to say what is living and what is dead, or what is organic and what is non-organic. In fact, I think Whitehead said this difference is tedious. There is no absolute distinction. I think of Teilhard de Chardin is doing the same thing. So in some sense, the template might be a template of life itself, that since we're living, we read back over nature. Like I like to call this retrospective induction, right? It's this notion of saying that what's expressed in us doesn't happen in a void. It doesn't come from an island. Or we aren't sort of ontological islands in a universe where we don't belong. It's like, in some sense, we do belong here since we emerged here. And if we didn't belong, we wouldn't have been, you know? And so experiences like life, value, this haunting by possibility, these are ontological notions that I think we can carefully read back over nature. And it may be the case that they never wholly disappear. I think it can be argued in Whitehead's frame, and not just his, that life in a rudimentary form can be seen as an ontological primitive. So can experience, so can value. And if you do have that, then there is, at least in part, no meaning to evolution beyond the complexification of those features which are ontologically dormant or ontologically primitive. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question. That may take on various morphologies physically, but those ontological domains in principle would remain there. But we're already into the weeds here theoretically. So
what would you say that like would a materialist critic of this type of philosophy, what might they say to what are the differences in outlook in terms of what we might find out, in space? Like what does what might, aside from like providing a template for what this commonality of life, what I'm trying to think how to formulate this. Like what might a critic say? What would a critic disagree with from like the Whiteheadian perspective in like the wider sphere of philosophy at present, but in this specific context?
Sure. Well, I think a critic would, and this happens a lot. Yesterday, I'm teaching a class on Whitehead now, and this comment came up that Whitehead's thinking is overly anthropomorphic, right? And what they mean by that is essentially that it's and it might even be anthropocentric in the sense that he's saying we cannot escape our own experience. We have to start from our own experience, and it's within that experiential context that we have to approach nature. And so Whitehead does find experience going all the way down in nature. He thinks we have to say that, at least in part, to make sense of the higher complexification and evolution of experience in the first place. So you'll know that Griffin calls that pan-experientialism, right? It's a form of panpsychism, but of course there's various nuances there. So some might want to say, well, it's not appropriate to take experience as expressed in human form and just extend it backward, because it may be that there's such diversities of experience of some kind that we simply don't want to be projecting our experience onto the world. But I do think that's a limited critique. Whitehead's not naively projecting human experience onto the world. There are vast and various ranges of experience. And yet, in principle, for him, there are, again, ontological elements that connect those experiences. There's something in common for him. So whether that is an experience of an amoeba or of a bacterium, which we know have forms of experience, right? Science has revealed this to us. The question is, I think, whether that element of experience ever gets cut off in nature, and then what remains. So it's a part of a much larger discussion, but the anthropocentric dimension is one critique that I think has limited appeal for some people, but going into depth, I think, calms that fear. If you jump back to the question about life in the universe, one might hold a reductive materialistic worldview. It's not as if science is compelling them to do that. So, right, this might be the more dogmatic element of someone's thought. And they might very well think that, well, we are the only planet where life and mind has birthed. in some sense. But again, as to why there would be the possibilities of life and mind in the womb of nature, which is just true, um, is a interesting kind of question. Um, as to why evolution should, as you signaled earlier, show forms of radical novelty coming into being, um, is also unanswered by science itself or evolution itself. Right? These are possibilities of novelty that are there. So I just think that you run into some philosophical and scientific problems by sticking with the reductive materialistic worldview. Um, and especially when you come to interpreting some forms of human experience, like we started talking about anomalous sort of forms of experience. If the data builds up so much so that our theories break down, we need to adjust our theories, and we need to have our theories be consistent with our practice. So Whitehead has a great statement that Griffin has reiterated throughout the years, and it's that we must bow to those presumptions which, in despite of criticism, we still employ for the regulation of our lives. In other words, what we inevitably presuppose in the practice of our lives, our experience, the domain of value, the fact of life, we have to fit that somehow into our theory. And always in the context of human beings not being isolated phenomena in this universe. Again, we are an expression of what this cosmos is up to and what its possibility is. And we have to extend that behind us and above us, but we have to do it carefully and not naively. So I think the critiques would be that there's a certain naivete going on here in extending the domains of human experience downward or upward or outward to other forms. Does that help?
Yeah. So when we look at when we look at this idea of a prevalence of life, well, you mentioned a couple things that you like some as possibilities present in the womb of the world or the womb of the universe, or I can't remember what noun you used after womb.
Womb,
but
womb is appropriate. Yeah.
Yeah, but
giving birth.
That's one of the things that I think that's one of the most important ideas. That's what stands out for me is this idea of possibility, that certain things are possible. What does it say about the world, the nature of the world, that certain things are possibility? Well, to me, maybe I've just got a simple mind, but it seems to imply that part of the nature of the world is that there exist certain things called possibilities. Like they have some kind of ontological status. It might not be the status of an electron, but the possibility itself is real, as in part of reality, as in part of whatever that thing is, that ultimate, that unity that we call reality, that there is a place somewhere for possibilities. And if we have if we are an expression of the possibility for a form of experience and a form of life that we deem human, then that is at some level like prevalent or present within that matrix of possibilities. So this is kind of we were talking about templates and morphological templates. So I'm open to there either being or not being like an almost universal morphological template, but on some other level of structure, there's like the structure of a human mind. I think that the possibility exists that we might find either minds radically different from our own, but also minds that we have the possibility to actually converse with in some manner, kind of like Star Trek world, where it's like, oh, well, we find another species and we they're intelligent, more or less on our level. And it's like, there's almost like this, a more general, a more vague template that kind of like pervades the cosmos. And it's like on whatever planets, in whatever solar systems where conditions are right, and we don't even know like exactly what all those conditions might be, but maybe it's just all peppered all over the solar system and the galaxies, and it's it's just a matter of getting there.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me comment on that. So first, to your point about possibilities, I think is such an important point for the history of philosophy. Right, possibility is one of the most fascinating philosophical facts and fascinating philosophical problems. Right. And it goes back to Plato, certainly, but others, but like this distinction between being and nothingness. Possibilities are not nothing, but they're certainly real. Right. But they're not physical. They're that which becomes actualized, but they're not actual in the sense that we are in ourselves, but they have this form of actuality there. right? So beginning at that level is important because I just don't see any way to get around the fact that there seems to be infinite possibilities of various kinds. As to their place in locus, right, that's another level up as to do we need a final explanation of possibilities? And Whitehead did something theological with that ultimately on philosophical grounds, on grounds of consistency, incoherence. But absolutely, the universe, we have to say, presupposes at least our possibility of life and mind. So possibilities of life and mind belong to the universe at its highest and most general level. Even presumably, if we weren't there, right? If we rewind the clock backward, our possibilities were there. So they're not dependent on us, right? This is possibility in its most transcendent kind of sense. I think we really have to face that. And I like thinking about that. At another level, we say that, well, okay, the universe has possibilities of life and mind, of which we are an exemplification. And now, is there anything in the universe that would restrict possibilities like that to only being realized once? And I don't really think there is, right? There's the whole evolutionary trajectories, right? So there have to be ripe environments to make those things actually plausible. But there's something about the nature of possibility which demands actuality, at least in one form. And I just wonder, I don't think there's any in principle limitation on those possibilities, such that where environments are ripe, they will emerge once again. And it may even be there may even be a telic element behind the evolutionary process too. After all, there's a sort of a rise in evolution and novelty that strains credulity here.
Yeah.
And I think we in part have to say that because we're an expression of it, right? So the element of possibility is fascinating. The possibility of life is there, and that might already be a philosophical context to say we live in a biological universe, at least at one level, right? So I love that discussion of possibility. Now, you jump back to this commonality of morphology, which I really think is plausible and fascinating too. Difficult to think about, but it's just relevant to point to the fact that current literature is also ripe with discussions of extraterrestrial commonality. Assuming we could come in contact, it's always science fiction, right? Assuming we could come in contact with other minds, other intelligent minds, what would be those features of commonality between us? How would contact and communication take place, right? And so and this gets to formal kinds of realities too, are mathematics shared among among minds, right? Is there one sort of pseudo-Platonic realm upon which we could say that we could commune at a patterned level of mathematical elegance? So a kind of rational value that might be a means of communicating. There's the element of value, right? Assuming value is not just projected onto a axiological tabula rasa in the universe, but value is something fundamental that intelligent minds discover and navigate and communicate. Maybe we communicate on levels of value. There's interesting stuff about music, extraterrestrial music, the harmonies and discords of music, and how that is a domain of value as well. So I just think it's timely. And I'm quite interested in extraterrestrial commonality. In fact, I'll share with you a statement, since you and I have just mentioned Griffin here. Griffin makes an interesting statement, and here I'm flipping through his book called Panentheism and Scientific Naturalism. He makes a statement about precisely this. So he says, and I know this is out of context, but just think of this for a moment. He says, this would mean that, or on other planets, with the conditions of life to emerge and evolve for many billions of years, we should expect there to be some with creatures that, no matter how different in physical constitution and appearance, so there's the morphology, would share some of our capacities, such as those for mathematics, music, and morality, or more generally, truth, beauty, and goodness. But so it's a great statement that, again, is saying, well, it may or may not be that we share the morphology, but there's more fundamental features that belong to this universe in addition to possibility, things like values, that could be meeting grounds for species that are evolved at similar kinds of levels.
Yeah, and it seems like mathematics would seem to be, and I don't think that this is an example of kind of the anthropocentrism that you were mentioning before, because I think mathematics is actually transcends our human conceptions of it. But you imagine two physically based beings meeting. I mean, they will be their very movements will be mathematical in some sense. And if they can recognize each other's movements, they can recognize the relationships of movements. And
Right.
and that's related to music too, because music is based on certain regularities and laws. So you have one note that's this long, and then another note that's half that length, and right there you've got a mathematical relationship. And as long as there's a shared environment, in which to communicate, there will be certain relationships and things that can be communicated and can be learned, I think. And I think, that's one of the tropes of science fiction is this idea of learning to communicate and finding the common language. And I think that would just be natural, that it would at least be possible. It might be difficult in certain circumstances, but
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's the whole sort of discussion about, and even Teilhard speculated about this. I don't know if you're familiar with Teilhard de Chardin's work, but he in addition to Whitehead, offered a more explicit early call for theology to deal with these unknown worlds, right? It's an explicit call for certain exo-theology. But he has these elaborate imaginative possibilities for new spheres meeting each other, that is, other psychically developed mind and life in the universe. And then he sort of descends from his giddiness and says, well, it's all very unlikely because we face these certain bottlenecks, right? Terrestrial bottlenecks. It seems unlikely that in the first place we could ever leave our planet. Well, we'll see about that, right? But also just the magnitudes of space, the separation, the sidereal distances that seem only impossible to cross, except for perhaps AI in the future. And so it's like it may be that the context of our contact and communication is going to be challenging. And then imaginably, if you assume that some species have got through those bottlenecks, that imagine that intelligence doesn't just inevitably destroy itself. Let's hope that's not the case on our planet, but let's imagine a species gets past this bottleneck, civilizational bottleneck. What's the means for doing so? And I think my colleague Roland Faber, who I edited this large text with Lexington, talks about extraterrestrial spiritual life, right? And questions of the Fermi paradox. And if we are to come in contact with other kinds of beings, it may be at the level of value and level of spirit. It may be at the level of benevolence in a certain sense, and not just a dark forest where every planet or species is as if a hunter trying to immediately eliminate whoever they see. It may be that for any species to get beyond its bottleneck, it has to advance spiritually, right? So that we stand to potentially encounter not simply extraterrestrial life that is as barbaric as our potential forms here on this planet, but that is much more spiritually advanced. And I think, not that we have to go back to the UFO phenomenon, but you do see a certain interesting spiritual dimension, transformative dimension in some of these accounts. And that, again, raises the larger question of the nature of spirituality, the nature of value, the nature of what this universe is or ought to be up to, right? There's that ought dimension. So it's such an interesting discussion, but we're sort of playing with the imaginations of communication here. But I agree that there should, in principle, be things that could be communicated, value transferred back and forth, whether mathematics, music, art, morality, or ethics. They don't have to map on directly like ours. It's almost surely the case that they wouldn't, but that there would be recognizable forms of these dimensions between us. I think we have to say, at least at almost a metaphysical level.
Mm-hmm. Like Thomas Nagel 12 or 14 years ago wrote that Mind of Cosmos book, right? Mind and Cosmos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting book because he came to some conclusions, I think, that were very compatible with a Whiteheadian, perspective. But seemingly on his own, like I'm not even sure if Nagel has read any Whitehead. At least he didn't give any explicit indication. You got a point there?
Well, no, I'm glad you brought Nagel up, because he gives a shout out, I think, very briefly to Whitehead and Whitehead and Griffin, believe it or not, in a footnote. Yeah, I recently reread that text. There's at least one reference in that book, but otherwise, I think he's sort of coming independently to these insights.
Yeah.
Anyway,
at
sorry
the very least,
no,
that's no problem. At the very least, he's presenting things. He's thinking on his own about it. Maybe he's got some influence underneath the surface, but he's giving his own his own thought processes, as he's going through these ideas. But Nagel's a kind of like a famous atheist, or at least like strongly agnostic, right? He explicitly writes in there, this might imply the existence of God, but I don't really like that idea. So I'm gonna try my best to come up with a reason or an explanation that doesn't use that. So he ends up coming up with this idea of like I can't remember his exact terminology, but basically like we were talking. You mentioned like telic, this idea of teleology. Basically, how did he think about it? Basically, a naturalistic teleology, that there is some kind of non-physical like attractors or these non-physical forms of some sort that kind of like that we're attracted to, that we like a final cause, like we kind of grow into it, and so, of course, that's very resonant with this notion of possibilities inherent in the womb of creation, and of course, like Whitehead's eternal objects and things in addition to other things, and there. So I think one way of explaining, like, not to come back to the morphological, form, but to some kind of form, like you were talking about, like even just the essence of life and experience being like we can call that a form. That there are these. What was the word? Do you remember the word he used for like that teleological form? I can't remember what it was. If it was like, I don't think he used the word attractor or anything like that. But anyways, I'll just call them attractors.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay.
But this idea of there being attractors that life is like is geared towards, where like here's the goal and here's where we are currently, and it's like, okay, well, we might veer off in this direction, and then but we're slowly getting it to that point, and another form of life might be veering off in this direction, but they come to a similar end. The paths they might have taken are different, and that might express itself, say, in a different morphological form, like a different body, but they get to a similar endpoint, which might have something. The way I see it, at least as a possibility, is they might have similar minds. So we might think about similar things. We might have basically a similar form of experience. We might have like a different range of sensations or a different different visual field. But maybe all life develops vision of some sort. Because I mean, even if you look at life on Earth, the different types of sensors in the history of biology, like the forms of sensing, like it might be that developing sensory organs of some sort is this kind of like universal possibility, and the exact functions or the exact form the organs take just is slightly or radically different, just like we see in species. But there's a lot of like convergent evolution that leads to convergent or what's the other word for? Well, is that for basically independent evolution of the same function, where they don't share an evolutionary history. So
right,
just some things
absolutely. Yeah. No, I think this is wonderful and speculative, and I think it's entirely plausible. So I'm fully with you there. And you're no doubt familiar with some of Simon Conway Morris's work, right? No. Perhaps where he's talking. Oh, okay. You should see "Lonely Minds in the Universe" is one of his texts, where he's talking about these convergent dimensions of evolution, where possibilities are so canalized in such a way that. That we do expect to see over and again, at least on this planet, the emergence and reemergence of life and morphological life. So he's often pitted against Stephen Jay Gould, right, who says, well, if we rewind the evolutionary process, there is no guarantee, and it's completely unlikely that we would reemerge again. And what Conway Morris in part demonstrates scientifically, that there are these convergent trends that we see witnessed over the history of evolution, and that we can be confident that we would see something like us, or very near in some way, reemerge. Right. And again, this is suggestive philosophically, because what the hell is going on here? Right. Mm-hmm. Again, this universe is up to something and not nothing. And interestingly enough, I think he restricts life and mind just to this planet. Conway Morris does, but there's no reason, I think, to not also extend those possibilities elsewhere. He discusses that a little bit. But let me go back to Thomas Nagel, because I love that book. It's a very important book, published in 2012. And although I don't know how indebted, as you said, he was to sort of Whitehead and Griffin, at least very small in part. Uh, but he does say something remarkable in that text. It's philosophically very rich text. And although he doesn't like God, partly because he thinks God is just some busybody in the sky somewhere, and that's what he does say in another interview. I just don't want the universe to be that way.
Yeah.
Well, what way, right? So what I always say to the atheist folk is, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And when they tell you, I'll say, man, I don't believe in that God either. And I'm an atheist to that God. But let me say something else that is so important about some of his statements, because at least in one place later in that book, he does talk about the possibility of life and mind and value being elsewhere. And he makes an extraordinary statement where he says there is not value because there's life. There is life because there's value. And this is an amazing statement because it seems to suggest in this language of attraction that life is something of intrinsic worth, that life is because it's good that it should be in some sense, that the universe from a broader level is in pursuit of the actualization of states of value, of which life and mind are an acute expression. So, and although he doesn't like God, we can still probe the fact that the possibilities, values, these are in the nature of things. There's standards, presumably, of value, right? So that a value realism, that's a part of his thinking in a certain respect. And where do those come from? What's the best ontological context or metaphysical context that makes comprehensive sense of that? And for a lot of people, they'd want to take it in a philosophical, theological direction. But to me, to just leave those things free floating in the cosmos seems to lack some parsimony. And at least for Whitehead, right, eternal objects needed a locus. They needed an ordering. They had to be ordered in terms of relevance, not just to each other, but to their entrance into the world. And that is a function that no finite entity of any kind could do. Right. So eternal objects are part of the primordial nature of God. And it's not just possibilities, as if possibilities can just be vacuous. Possibilities are of something, possibilities of states of being that are better and worse, right? So with possibilities comes this element of value. And so, at least for Whitehead, theologically, although his theology is quite different from classical theology, God is the primordial context in which possibility and value are evaluated and stored, exist. And that's not a move that a lot of folks want to make, and fair enough, but that has been one of the traditional functions of philosophical theology. God is that in which there would be, that without which there is no possibility and value at all, or that in the nature of things which distinguishes what is from what might be, or facing towards the past, what was from what could have been. Right? So there's distinctions between actuality, past, present, and future that are ontologically relevant, and God becomes one term, perhaps an adequate term, to make sense of those utmost metaphysical problems, arguably.
Well, and since we're on the subject of extraterrestrial life, from a certain perspective, the notion, like the idea and being of God, if we take a panentheistic, view of reality, I mean, of course, we're part of God, God's part of us, but God's also part of everything else out there. So there's a sense in which God is an extraterrestrial, because it's a pan-terrestrial.
Yeah, sure.
It's God's all over the place.
Yeah.
And
well,
no, go ahead on that.
I was just going to say on that, there has been a lot of work. Nick Bostrom, even in my book Metaphysics of Exo-Life, I'm dialoguing with Stephen J. Dick, NASA's former chief historian, and he, along with others, put forth this notion of God as a super intelligence, right? A naturalistic super intelligence. And this theory is also put out in the AI discussion. It's quite interesting, and they want to make it seem as if this is a satisfactory notion of God, right? And often it's super intelligence that's fully contingent upon cosmological evolution, right? So the super intelligent wasn't in the beginning. There's no necessary existence associated with it, but that it evolves later in the course of evolution. But again, at least in my book, I combat that a bit by saying, and Dick even suggests with others that a natural super intelligence may be responsible for fine-tuning the various cosmological constants, which have to be the way they are, at least most physicists think, for us to be here. And yet I'm not sure that's adequate, that a fully contingent superintelligence could do that, because it would seem that a a superintelligence itself, if it's fully contingent and dependent on evolution, is also an expression of that fine tuning, right? So there's an element in that superintelligence that would need to transcend that tuning in order to make that tuning be what it is. So at least I argue that that transcendent dimension of the divine is Whitehead's primordial nature, whereas what he calls the consequent nature is this evolutionary superintelligence that in every moment is incorporating what the world achieves and is changing and evolving is consequent with the world. So I like the superintelligence discussion, but I think it, to the extent that it lacks a necessary base, an eternal base, I think we run into, again, some philosophical problems, because the possibility of the superintelligence is there in the nature of things before it was. And so again, we're back to asking about the grounds of the possible, of which a certain form of philosophical theology would help resolve.
I like,
there's no dogmatism in this, of course. It's not dogmatic claims, but we're struggling as beings that the universe has produced for coherence and parsimony in our thinking, and which we value.
I like to think about the kind of one of the overarching ideas that you were just talking about is a kind of cosmic foreshadowing, that when you look at a state, you look at a state in the past, well, it actually foreshadows the future, because like what amazes me, and I'm surprised more people don't talk about it. I know some do, but you look at just something like basic chemistry in the periodic table of elements. Like there's foreshadowing in the periodic table of elements. You've got all of these elements, and of course, you smash them together and explode them and stuff, and you get all kinds of different molecules, different different combinations of these molecules, and so we get more stuff. We get different types of things. We get states of matter and all this chemistry and cool stuff. But within that, there is also the possibility to put these things together in such a way that is very hard to occur just by chance, and we get complex organisms. Like, it's very hard to create a cell. Like a cell is one of those things that has so much complexity in it. Like, a single cell is in many ways more complex than the most complex computer, and that's just a single cell. And you need a single cell in order to start the chain of life. And yet the possibilities for all of those forms that come from cells are inherent in just those, just a handful of those elements. And like the way I see it is kind of like that suggests to me a type of forethought, maybe not to try not to anthropomorphize it too much, that those future possibilities needed to be anticipated, or were anticipated in some way, in those, that very basic formation of the structure of the cosmos. It's like, and the only thing I can imagine that would make sense is if that's the mind of God being basically like, okay, this is like the rough plot line for the universe that I've got in mind, right? At a certain point, we're going to need to develop some biological life, but in order to do that, we have to make the elements in this way. They might not come together in such a way as to make any biology for a long time, but that possibility needs to be there. We need to make sure the elements are able to do that when the time comes, right? And then the first life appears in the universe, and it's like, okay, that was inherent in all of that chemistry. Before anyone ever saw, some fleshy tissue, it was inherent in those gaseous and those hard, in those metals and in those weird elements.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think we have to say that. And then the larger question is just, well, how do we make sense of that theoretically in a theological framework? And I'm fine with speaking of the mind of God. That some of the best thinkers of our species, of our extraterrestrial species, right? After all, if there is even one perspective elsewhere that makes us extraterrestrials, have spoken of the mind of God and its necessity in very profound and often diverse ways. But yeah, I love your statements about the complexity of the cell. I think most people neglect to really understand that. It's like the universe is basically simple. It's a conglomerations of dead matter, right, which would lack certain complexity. But no, when you look at the cell, it is unbelievably complex, an expression of order, an expression of aesthetic order, Whitehead would remind us, right? And I think this is another point pushing at the boundaries or the presuppositions of science in a certain way. Like I think of statements in Religion in the Making just on this aesthetic theme, which would be applicable to Nagel too, because Nagel's talking about these inherent potencies and values. But Whitehead says it's not the case that there is a world that happens to express an order. He says there is an order, there is a world because there is a more fundamental order. And then he asks essentially about the status of that order. And order is an aesthetic concept. So is harmony. So is complexity, right? Even the cell itself is an expression of a certain aesthetic intensity that's been achieved. And even Charles Hartshorne makes a great statement where he says, I forget where he's responding to questions about the laws of nature, and he says the laws of nature are already an expression of deeper aesthetic principles, a harmony and intensity, for example. And then he makes the claim that there are laws of nature because there are aesthetic values. Right. So again, we're pushing back, saying any expression of order is an expression of value, of aesthetic value. And now, if we take that insight and we build a cosmos out of it, you see a cosmos that is achieving states of intrinsic value, aesthetic value. Maybe intrinsic value comes later, but complexity as well. And we are an expression of that as well. There's no way to get around the fact that we are a remarkable expression of order and at least aesthetic value. And if the universe is into it, this is telic element, teleological element. If the universe is up to the production of beauty, as Whitehead puts it, I think that is a foreshadowing, to use your term, of what we ourselves should be up to, right? Mm-hmm. Because I get the question a lot when I talk to different people, well, what are we supposed to be up to in the universe? And I think one fun way of responding to that is saying, well, what you should be up to in the universe is what the universe is up to in you, right? So you are an expression of value, of possibility in this universe. And now it is your task to inject and create more value and beauty in this universe. Now, you mentioned God being an aspect of this conversation, having a rough plan, right? So we want to be careful. We wouldn't want to say that, this is not, so speaking with the musical metaphor, it's not an unfolding score that's been pre-written, right? Right. It's a freestyle jazz composition in which everyone has a co-creative possibility. So at least for Whitehead's thinking, which has obviously influenced me much, God creates self-creators, right? Mm-hmm. God provides the context of possibility in which the universe can create itself, right? So elements of freedom are woven all the way down, and creativity are woven all the way down. So, yeah, I mean, I'm always pushing back at not taking ourselves out of this universal picture. We're made of cells. And we are much more than cells as well. So anyway, I mean, we can go wherever you'd like from there, but.
Well, yeah, maybe a few more questions, a few more back and forths, and then we can call it quits for today. But yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that nature of freedom, and co-creation, like creating co-creators, is that part of how we do what we do is that any form is also a limitation, right? So there are constraints. So the part of the reason in the manner in which we have free will is because we are constrained in some form. And one of those constraints would be like, as physical beings at this stage in our being, we are constrained by, for example, the elements like that I just mentioned, like that periodic table of elements. Like we have certain material to work with, and it seems like, so part of it is kind of not only certain material to work with, but this gets to I think like the root of Whitehead's philosophy is the nature of that, the kind of root nature of everything being an instantiation of like this, or of this actual occasion of experience, where we are this something. And what is the nature of creativity and the something that does something? Well, we take in our current context and all of our past context, and all of our past informs us in this moment, and all of our present, which now is the past, in terms of looking at it, informs where we are. And then with that picture of the world, however vague and however vague and unclear it might be to our our conscious awareness, we've got all this context and all of this history and all of these habits and all of this stuff impinging on us. And then it's like in an instant, all of that, our mind or our that mental pole of us at some level has to kind of cram all of that information and say, okay, now what can we do? Right. What are our options? And we're like this kind of like strategic military planner. It's like, okay, give me all the data. Where are all the troops? And now what can we do given all of that data? And that's So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind about the nature of freedom, is that we have stuff to work with, and there might be loopholes of some sort, or being aware of something might give us even more possibilities, open up the range of possibilities for what we can do. But we still have to deal with where we came from and where we are at the present moment.
The past is stubborn, right? We all know that in our experience. But no, that's beautifully the way you put that. You've just sort of quickly run through the inner emergence of an occasion of experience in Whitehead's language and what it does. So I'm at present trying to finish a book this year, which is an introduction. It's called Whitehead's Universe, Philosophical Foundations of Process Theology. It aims to be the next most palatable introduction for beginning level students. And I've been struggling through how to communicate, right? What happens. And one way, this is language Whitehead uses, but one way he discusses it is, in every moment there's phases of inheritance, of reception, of anticipation, of decision, right? So this phase of inheritance is from this physical pole. It's what the objective data of the past gives the becoming moment in each and every sense, right? And this element of reception is the way in which that we're incorporating that past into who we are becoming, right? And then the sense of anticipation as to what we might do with it, given a range of limited possibilities. And then, Whitehead even uses the language of decision, quote unquote, at this most fundamental level of ontology. Some possibilities are cut off, right, which is the root word of decision, root meaning, and some are realized. And it's just beautiful vision of us inheriting of a beautiful synthetic vision of individuation in which we have a creative role. So the power of the past is strong, but it never utterly fully determines, at least for Whitehead, the mental pull of the occasion and what it's capable of. There's that slice of self-determination in every event, which at very, very high evolutionary levels becomes the kind of creative freedom that we all enjoy. So I think that's just such a beautiful vision. We need freedom as one of these, Griffin calls it a hardcore common sense notion. Can't get away from it, even if we try. Expel it with a pitchfork, and it ever returns, right? This is the way Whitehead puts it. I like to call it freedom and value, these types of things, presuppositional imperatives. It's like we have to presuppose them in our theory, and so we shouldn't deny them in our practice. Freedom is one of those. But let me just comment on one thing you began with, which was this question of limitation, of restriction, because there's so many ways in which decisions restrict some possibilities and enable others, right? Every decision we make is about restricting and enabling certain possibilities to be fulfilled. Even at a cosmological level, this is applicable, right? You have physicists talking about, well, what's the selecting factor? So everyone seems to know that in some way, not all possibilities can be actualized at once without utter chaos, right? Even the quote unquote fine tuning assumes that there's been some sort of, selective factor. There's limitation on infinite abstract possibilities such that something can be procured. And even Whitehead says this limitation seems absurd. Like, why 3 dimensions of space when there could be presumably 13 or any other sort of understanding? And he says these selective limitations at a final cosmological level indicate that there's something special going on in our cosmic epoch. That doesn't mean we're the cream of the crop, we're special, but that these are decisions, quote unquote, of utmost generality about the kind of possibilities that might be made available for this universe. And again, finally, for Whitehead, God has in principle, God is the principle of limitation, which limits infinite abstract possibilities so something of value can eventually emerge. And we are less intense, perhaps, expressions of that in our daily life. We limit possibilities all the time, such that value can be achieved. So, and that's related to freedom, so just connect those limitations and possibilities of freedom.
Yeah, and that's you could even think of, well, ourselves and God as kind of an artist to bring back this aesthetic sense, because, what does an artist do? It's like, well, oh, that's not quite right yet. Or a musician, I'm a musician. It's like, that's not
Nice.
quite right yet, and then when you shape it enough, and then it finally clicks, and it's like, okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's like you can apply that template, that experience to like anything. Well, maybe anything. Going back to use some of the examples that we've brought up so far, it's like back to the fine tuning of the constants. It's like, oh
Yeah.
no, that's not quite right. It'll have to be okay. There it is. Like that's an aesthetic sense, right? That's the artist's sense. No,
Yeah.
no, no. Okay, there it is. Or creating the periodic table of elements. Oh no, we're gonna need. Okay, there, got it. That's now it's just right. We all have
Sure.
that, and that's an intrinsic experience of value where it's just nope, not quite. Oh, yep, that's it. It's that experience is one of value. That form that you're searching for is the more valuable one. That's if people are wondering, hear the word value and it's kind of an abstraction to them. Well, we experience it all the time. That's why we have a word for it. But that's an example of it where we're searching for something, and then when we find it, we know what it feels like to find it. We know what value feels like. And that's
Beautiful.
kind of one of the humorous pictures I have of the mind of God is kind of like this artist being like, no, not quite right, and just
right.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's cool that you're a musician. I mentioned this Lucian Price book called The Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead. Again, a lot of rich content. There's some controversy surrounding it because he's quoting Whitehead at length, and we don't know if that's possible or not, but there's a wonderful couple paragraphs where Whitehead's talking about music, and he does it a lot. Music he's a lover of music, and he talks about a conductor in a symphony, and it's in the context of possibility too, which is really cool because he's saying, any expression of a conductor in a symphony is ongoing, but he says everywhere around the conductor hover these infinitudes of possibility, other ways in which this beauty could be expressed, right? And it's this beautiful image, right, of this conductor that's, maybe the aim is for something harmonious and beautiful, but the way of getting there and the twists and turns and the discordant elements belong to that, right? But there's that element of selection. And if you were to do the concert over again, it would not be exactly the same, right? But you might be aiming for similar achievements of aesthetic intensity. So I think this element of value you're talking about is extremely fundamental. In my first book, Mind, Value, and Cosmos, I talked about the axio-noetic tradition of philosophical theology, where axia, value, and noetikos, mind, have always been a fundamental part of it in some deep sense. I just think we cannot escape that axiological dimension, and we do so at our peril. I think, to go back to Nagel, I think there is life because there's value and there's standards of value, and it seems to be the case that the universe is in the business of infinitely exploring possibility and value. And I think that gives us a foreshadow, a nice purpose of what we should be up to, at least in part, creatively, to do our part in that exploration. After all, if God is doing it, how can we afford not to also be doing that in some sense, So I'm wanting to offer an inspiring worldview that it gives people inspiration, but I also wanted to map into the way things actually are. And I think that's sort of a religious or spiritual drive too, because as Griffin would tell us, the fundamental base conviction of the religious intuition is to be in harmony with the nature of things as they are. And that's what I'm trying to do, I think. And perhaps you are as well, with your music, with your writing, with your interest.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Well, that's been great. I'll just give one more, maybe an opening for an answer, or just we'll see where it goes. But coming back to the beginning of our discussion, and talking about the current state of just public discourse and academic discourse on UFOs and non-human intelligence, I think that there's still. I hope you look at this in the future, because especially even looking at like what Diana Walsh Pasulka is writing about, from her perspective, from religious studies perspective, if you look at the field of religious studies, it's all, okay, well, here's what people think, but we won't wonder if it's real or not, right? So here are all the conceptions of angels and otherworldly beings and anything that you might conceive of as non-human intelligence. Well, maybe they're not, maybe a lot of these experiences have nothing to do with extraterrestrials. So it might be a separate question than the one you're dealing with, currently. But to take a non sectarian or non-dogmatic, leaving behind any of the specific, specific dogmas about different types of beings like angels or demons or something like that, to kind of take a scientific attitude and say, okay, well, here are all these accounts of different possible non-human intelligences. Here are the kind of experiences people have reported all through history and now in the current. And to kind of collate all of these conceptions and all of these experiences but to then add on to that, well, with the condition that they might actually be veridical in some sense. Like these experiences aren't necessarily just hallucinations. Like if there's a history of interaction with beings that people have considered angels, well, what might be the nature of that experience? And if there is a real being, what is the nature of that being? I think that would be a really cool direction for, philosophy to start going into, actually considering, okay, well, using different philosophical frameworks, what are the possibilities for thinking about what we might consider as a whole range of non-human intelligences, not just on the level of, well, in addition to the level of the intelligences we experience in this world normally, like you mentioned, like cephalopods and and dogs and cats and all these other animals that we interact with, but to kind of go the Griffin department, the Griffin path of the parapsychology and say, okay, let's take a look at all these anomalous experiences with potential non-human intelligences. I think that would be pretty cool.
Totally. Oh, I fully agree with you. And yeah, I do want to, again, I mentioned to jump into that in much more depth. And these recent texts are fascinating. And I agree. I'm annoyed with like the religious studies people. I mean, they're doing fine work, but like the idea that you can simply, it's like studying the phenomena from a distance and saying, and like deliberately having no confessional opinion about it that you want to voice for fear of A, B, or C. Like there's a place for that, a distance with the phenomena, but I think we need to take it much, much more seriously. And I think philosophy will continue to develop in that direction. Theology will continue to develop. I would anticipate a whole host of new texts in the next several years. I got another one I'm working on slowly with a few colleagues. But so absolutely, I think we need to pay attention to this. And you may remember from the opening of Griffin's parapsychology book, where I think the introduction was called like White Crows Abounding, right? And he makes this case that, well, all you need is one white crow to show you that not all crows are black. But in our case, we don't have one, we have a whole bunch of white crows. So now you can apply that to near-death experience phenomena, which is like there's a lot of maybe bad evidence, but there's a lot of good evidence too. Arguably, there's a lot of evidence, and I think with the anomalous phenomena of abductions and UFO, I think we have to stay empirically minded, and we have to expand our notion of what's possible for the universe. We may be witnessing a bunch of white crows, but if you witness a bunch of white crows in a worldview that tells you that there's only black crows, there's going to be a dissonance here. So that's where these theoretical foundations, I think, connect to this empirical phenomenon. I want to keep those close. I think Whitehead would do that too in a certain respect. So I think we agree on that.
All right. Well, I think we've approached our time limit. So thank you, Andrew. It's been I've had a blast talking with you. It's been great.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks very much. I hope we get a chance to do it again.
All right. Take care.